Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you are currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps along your journey. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now, let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world. Every so often, we may just need to hibernate. Hibernation, if you don't remember this, hibernation refers to a season of heterothermy, which is characterized by low body temperature, slow breathing and heart rate, and low metabolic rate. It's often associated, of course, with cold weather months, with rodents and bears. You know, we always talk about bears hibernating. A season and a time where they hibernate to slow their body temperature, their breathing, their heart rate, their metabolic rate, in order to reserve their energy until more sufficient food sources are available. Well, researchers over time have wondered whether humans could benefit from their bodies entering into this hibernation-like states. They've looked into this of research around, especially when someone is dealing with a critical disease or something about their body is needing to heal. Are there ways in which we could help enter them into hibernation mode to slow their temperature, slow their breathing, their heart rate, their metabolic rate, so that their body was able to recover in ways that they can't do when it's functioning normally? Well, as I think about this term hibernation, I also sometimes wonder whether our own minds and hearts need brief hibernation. Now, maybe not a full season of hibernation, but we need to find moments for our minds and hearts to find brief moments of hibernation. Sometimes there's a season or moments of us where we need to lower our body temperature, lower our heart rate, lower and slower our pace so that our bodies can recover and restore. I think about the time, at least for our family, right after Christmas, where the rush of the season is over. We talked about that in a previous podcast, about that incessant rush that happens from Black Friday all the way up through the holiday season. But for our family, right after Christmas, and the rush is over, the parties are over, that we covet these few days in between Christmas and New Year's, where we actually, our extended family, some of the extended family members, they refer to this as a Barger lock-in, where basically just our family, it's almost like we lock the doors and we just hibernate for a few days together. We watch movies, we put a fire in the fireplace, we slow down, we are just resting and recovering, and it's amazing how much our family covets those few days of brief hibernation, a time for us to slow our body temperature, to slow our breathing, our heart rate, and to just rest. Moments of recovery and refueling for the new growth that's soon to come, and when the pace, it's time to pick back up. There was a Forbes article not too long ago talking about the complexity and the speed in the world today, and especially targeted thinking about leaders and executives, all these people in teams and organizations all around the world, that in the midst of this complexity and this speed that we're all rushing at and that we're facing today, that oftentimes our minds and our hearts, we get tricked into thinking that what's needed and that what the answer to this is to run faster, to achieve more, and that we buy into this myth that the faster we run, the further we get. And yet the whole purpose of this article in Forbes was talking about this idea of slowing down in order to power up. Slow down in order to speed up later. Slow down and actually become more effective when it's time to power back up and get focused on what are the things that need our attention. What are the things we need to put into practice? Where is it that we're going to go? that we must actually find time in the midst of complexity and speed, is we just can't run faster and faster. There's some things and sometimes moments and seasons where maybe we need brief hibernation. We must find time to lower our body temperature, slow our breathing, slow our heart rate, think, center ourselves, plan, align ourselves with each other and the mission and where we're actually trying to go, so we're able to move forward more purposefully. There are also moments, as we know, and seasons in our life and in our work that require a slower pace. We know there are those projects that come up along our path that we need to just slow down, and it requires us to move at a different pace. We know that there are times in our lives where we are sick, we're dealing with illness, or someone around us is dealing with an illness, and it requires us to move at a slower pace. I remember a guy that I know, Andy Politz is his name, who's been on a number of missions to hike Mount Everest. And he and his team of people, in fact, there's some of the people that have made their way up and hiked Mount Everest. And I remember one time when he was telling me about one of his expeditions where he recalled the fact that when you get to a certain elevation on Mount Everest, when you get up high enough on Mount Everest, you reach a point where it requires 4 breaths before you can even take a step. 4 breaths, because the oxygen is so thin, it requires you to slow your pace and your heart rate, and everything about your movements has to slow because it requires 4 breaths to do anything. And so he tells this great story. I mean, he recounts every little tiny movement they do, from waking up in the middle of the night in their tents to taking 4 breaths. And then they could sit up in their tent. 4 breaths, put on their shoe. 4 breaths, tie their shoe. 4 breaths, put on the other shoe. 4 breaths, tie that shoe. And so on and so on. And he recounted having to get up in the middle of the night to begin this process because everything was at such a slower pace because it required 4 breaths before you could do anything. And I remember after hearing that story and thinking how amazing that was and what a cool story it was, and just thinking about it in the context of hiking Mount Everest and what an amazing experience that must be. But the story took on an even more powerful meaning in times in my life when thinking about when my mom was first diagnosed with cancer, or the second time she was diagnosed with cancer. And seeing how all of a sudden in the midst of those moments that our lives all of a sudden needed a different pace. I think about my mom and my dad both laying in hospital beds at the same time with different things they were dealing with. And the fact that all of a sudden in the midst of family life, work life, all the things on a daily basis that we were needing to do to move throughout the world, and yet what was required in those moments was actually slowing down, that I had to take 4 breaths before I could accomplish any task. We know that there are times in our personal lives, certainly the illnesses of loved ones, but also complex issues at work. Complex relationship issues at work with team members, projects that require our full heart and mind, or a pivotal relationship in your life or work that just needs more attention. There are times where we need 4 breaths so that we can even take that next step. I remember, of course, the famous story that it goes something like this, that there were a bunch of European missionaries that had a project in Africa that they were excited to work on. And so they arrive in Africa and they hire some local villagers to guide them on their hike to their final destination. And after the first full day of hiking along with their guides, all of a sudden one of the guides stops and turns back to the group and just says, "This is enough moving for today." The missionaries, of course, are all excited to get to their destination, and so they question this because they say, we have further to go. We can't stop. And yet the African guide, the villager, responds back to them, "We are moving too quickly. We must stop and rest. We must stop and rest here and wait for our souls to catch up. We're moving too quickly. We must stop here and rest and wait for our souls to catch up." I love that quote and I love that story because I think about the times in our lives and the times I've in working with leaders and teams and organizations and cultures that are trying to build these compelling and authentic experiences and performance and metrics in the world, that even in the midst of that path, that movement, there are times where we need to be able to slow down in order to power up. There are times where we need to be able to slow down and rest so that we can allow our souls to catch up. That it's not just about the doing of things or the accomplishing of tasks, that it's about the soul, the rich purpose and connection and leadership that's at the heart of it that matters. And so sometimes we need time, even brief moments, to hibernate, to step back, slow our heart rate, slow our body temperature, allow ourselves time to think, to plan, to align, to execute. So, a few questions for you to step back and to ponder this week or along your path, or maybe during this season of hibernation, or hopefully there are times throughout your year where you purposely plan time, even brief moments, to hibernate, to allow yourself to slow that down. Here are some questions or some things to step back and ponder this week or into the future. When in your calendar year do you need to make time to hibernate, to slow down, to take those 4 breaths, to allow your soul to catch up? In what ways, with the people on your team or throughout your company or organization, can you create time to slow down in order to power up? And in a world of complexity and speed, what in your life and work right now needs more time to heal, to recover? What needs more intentional thought? Remember, some situations may require a few moments to hibernate, to take those 4 breaths, to slow down and allow your soul to catch up. Slow down in order to power up. Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast platform or social media platform you're using, and share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of this conversation. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or this kind of development would add value to your team or organization, we hope you'll contact us at www.jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we all are ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.